Good morning. I'm Barry Smith. It is so great to be here in a congregation that has proved to be one of the most significant church homes in my life. Even though I retired to North Carolina in 2018, I have kept my membership here and am still serving as the congregation's historian. It is an honor to be part of the celebration recognizing Beth's 30th year of being an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA. I was on the search committee in 2013 that nominated Beth as a candidate as our current pastor. She is the third woman to hold a pastor position here and the first woman to serve as solo pastor. As she also said earlier, she is also the first out queer pastor as well. Even though it has been 10 years since our denomination changed its constitution to allow LGBTQ clergy, and even though the More Light movement for the LGBTQ rights within the Presbyterian Church has significant roots right here in this congregation, it is still rare for a local church to call and hire LGBTQ persons. One estimate is that there are fewer than 50 installed LGBTQ pastors in our denomination today. How did we, Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church, get to the point in its history to accomplish calling a person like Beth, and more specifically, how did it become such a major player in the entire More Light movement? Let me first explain where the phrase more light comes from. It goes back to 1620 when a pilgrim pastor, the Reverend John Robinson, was preaching to the pilgrims about to sail to the New World on the Mayflower. He stated that God has yet more light and truth to break forth from the Word, where Word is defined as the content of the Bible, as well as all that we know from Jesus' life and ministry. You will also hear the phrase More Light Church, which refers to Presbyterian churches which welcome LGBTQ people to full membership and full participation. This congregation is a More Light Church, and I'll explain how we got to that point. Another thing to explain is when we talk about the General Assembly, that is the national governing body for the Presbyterian Church, and when we mention the word presbytery or presbyteries, those are the regional governing bodies. For example, we are in the Chicago Presbytery. Well, the place to start with this story is with our congregation's most famous catalyst and prophet, David Sint. The Reverend Janie Spahr was also an early More Light leader as well, but Janie will share more of her story later. David Sint was a Presbyterian minister ordained in 1965. He had served 2 associate pastor positions in Chicago and St. Paul, Minnesota, and was beginning to feel that the traditional patterns of ministry becoming less effective. We think that today, and he was way ahead of his time. This is back in the 1960s. He thought taking a social work approach to groups might offer new ways of doing ministry. He thus got a master's of social work in 1971. It was during this time that he began to identify as an openly gay man. In one of his writings in 71, he stated, "I began to see for the first time a focus to my ministry. This was the second time at which I was really aware of a sense of call to the ministry other than when I decided to go to seminary. It was clear to me that I might be in a unique position in the Presbyterian Church among the clergy to be honest about my gay identity, and that this honesty might well mean the end of my career as an ordained minister." That statement was to prove all too prophetic. Meanwhile, David began working for the state of Illinois in the Department of Children and Family Services, but for his real vocation, he was seeking to develop a ministry between the Presbyterian Church and the lesbian and gay community, as we called it back then. A radical idea for the time. Remember, this was only 2 years after the Stonewall Rebellion in New York City, which had launched the modern gay rights movement. With the assistance of our forward-thinking pastor at that time, the Reverend Bill Taylor, this congregation tried to hire David as an assistant pastor in 1972. This is believed to be the first time that a U.S. Presbyterian congregation called a gay man to be on its pastoral staff. Unfortunately, but not unsurprisingly, this call was blocked by our denomination. Subsequently, David was asked by our session to serve in an unofficial capacity in reaching out to the LGBTQ community. David also expanded his vision beyond Chicago and went on to organize the National Presbyterian Gay Caucus in 1974. This included his now iconic act of holding up a sign at the 1974 General Assembly, our national governing body, that said, "Is anyone else out there gay?" This gay caucus had its first meeting at that General Assembly with about 25 people in attendance. As you can imagine, the caucus faced enormous opposition at that time, but it survived and thrived.
Davidson was well known to so many of us with that famous sign that said, "Is anybody else out there gay?" And I came to know David and his parents throughout the years. Gus and Char Sint were called our mom and our pop, and that is, so many of us that came to the assembly were really without parents or without those that really accepted us. So they became our parents, and we practiced with them. They were a beacon to all of us. And one time at the assembly, Maggie Kuhn came, who was the head of the Grey Panthers, and David's mom, and she pretended that they were lesbians together. It was really quite fun. Also, we wanted to thank them, but also to thank David. Because if you knew David, he was quiet, yet clear and passionate. And it was really, we gave him, we had an artist make a painting of irises, because he was a great, well-known as being a wonderful iris grower, with a fence, a white fence, and just to say to him, "David, you have so many gifts, and yet you began this liberation movement." So he became ill, and for a while there, we thought it was Bell palsy. And so several of us at General Assembly, he laid on the floor of the suite, and we held him, and we prayed with him. Well, not soon after that, as you know, he developed HIV and AIDS, and several of us around the country, because several of you took care of him, and several of us then called him on the phone. As he was dying, Lisa Bove called me and said, "Janie, it's time." And we thanked him. We thanked him for this amazing liberation movement that he had done. It was so poignant when he left us, because we knew then that we must become brave like him. Earlier in 1976 to 1978, Thelma Adair was the first African-American moderator of the Presbyterian Church. And during that time, she appointed Virginia West Davidson as chair of this Church and Homosexuality Task Force. This task force developed this amazing epic piece, really. It was the educational wonder, really, of the time, because they looked at what it was to be gay from a biblical, theological, psychological, this amazing piece. It was so well done that several denominations came and said, "Oh, we want to have this too." So right away, I think they sold like 40,000 copies in one day, which made the church cranky. Because during that study, they really saw that it was testimony of our people, of our LGBT people, that was changing this reflection of this committee. But during that time, I came out to my former husband, Jimmy, and because we had this great youth group at First Pres San Rafael. And this is what we said to them: "You can tell us anything, and it's a safe place for you to be." And by God, they did tell us everything. So with that, their honesty so struck me that I had to look at myself. So I came to our Presbyterian meeting, much as Barry talks about the Chicago Presbytery. Ours was Redwood Presbytery. So I came to that Presbytery and walked in the door, and I was supposed to talk about the correlation between sexism and heterosexism. Only they used the word homophobia then. Tell us about that, Janie. And as I walked in, there was Bill Johnson, the first United Church of Christ gay pastor, and Ellen Barrett, the first Episcopal deacon. And I heard their story. My heart was like pounding, like, oh my God, I think that's who I am. So I came running home to Jimmy, and I burst into the door and I said, Jimmy, I'm a lesbian. And he went, oh, thank God, I've known for a year, I've been waiting for you to tell me. Chris Glasser was part of that task force. And with that, he came to our church at First Presbyterian San Rafael because of Bear Ride and then her husband, Shannon. And they invited him to come. You can't, seeing him, how much he loved being gay, how much he loved the church. It was so astounding to be in his presence. And our youth then said, Janie, we've just got to go to the assembly, the 1978 assembly, and we'll talk about what happened there. So shall I talk about the slide? So on the slide, do you see the slide over there? So I want to name some of these great people. If you look, you will see Lorna Wirtz, Lisa Bove, Shirley Hinkamp, who was from West Park, Moorlight Church, Jim Anderson, David Sint, Rosemary Wallace, Dan Smith, who was our parliamentarian, and then you look down, Roger Wilson, and Chris Glasser, and then the photo should have also included Sandy Broaders, Bill Silver, Ralph Carter, Keith Hirschberger, and this guy right here. So, in those days, our caucus, we would go because none of us had any money. And so there was a suite that we had. So we finally decided so many people snored. So we had to put half of the people had to go into the snorer's room and the other half. And we didn't care if you were male, female, or whatever. I think we slept with each one of us, not that way, but it was the snorers and the not snorers. So that was how we began.
Yes, I can honestly say that I slept with Janie Spahr
Yes!
in that context. Starting in the mid-1970s, another problem surfaced for David. Because he was without an official call for 2 years, he had to relinquish his ordination. And this didn't just happen, it was a long, drawn-out legal process in the church courts. But he did eventually demit. At his request, he was then transferred to this congregation as a lay member in 1977. David continued to be heavily involved with the Gay Caucus as well as working full-time as a social worker. The caucus changed its name to Presbyterians for Gay Concerns because straight allies were an important part of the organization. And just to clarify, there were actually 4 different names the caucus underwent during its history. In 1974, it was the Presbyterian Gay Caucus, which became the Presbyterians for Gay Concerns in 1977, which became Presbyterians for Lesbian Gay Concerns in 1980, but we always just called it PLGC because who wanted to list that whole name every time? And then finally in 1999, it became More Light Presbyterians, which is still in existence today as an active organization. But back to the 1970s, the next milestone event, not only for Presbyterians for Gay Concerns, but for the church as a whole, was the 1978 General Assembly, in which the Assembly passed what became known as the definitive guidance that said gay and lesbian people were not eligible to hold ordained office in our denomination, and that included pastors, elders, and deacons. It was a big setback for the fledgling More Light movement. Janie has already mentioned the report prepared by the Committee on the Church and Homosexuality for the 78th General Assembly. You can share what some of that assembly was like.
So Jim and I, my former husband and I, went to this assembly thinking, because we had met Chris Glasser, and so we thought, well, this is going to be a wonderful assembly. And I took my youth group. We slept on the floor of a local church. This was going to be quite a time. And then, there's a picture up there, I think, that should be, and I want you to see who these people are, because I want us to honor them so much. Chris Glasser was at Yale Divinity School. He was on the task force of the Church in Homosexuality, and he was a candidate in California. Then you had David Sint, who was our leader, our liberation person, our teacher, our social worker, our preacher, and also an iris grower. Then you had Sandy Broaders, who at the last minute was voted as the Princeton Theological Seminary delegate to go to the assembly, and for some unbelievable reason, she was appointed to the committee that was studying this. And then you had Bill Silver. Bill Silver was an openly gay candidate out of New York Presbyterian, and he had passed all his ordination exams, he had done everything to be ready for, and he was ready to seek a call. And the New York City Presbytery said, let's go to the assembly, let's ask, can we overture the assembly? Well, they were to decide if a candidate met all the requirements for ordination, is ready to seek a call, and is gay, how can they proceed? The General Assembly Committee, who studied this and was supposed to look at everything, I can't begin to tell you what happened there. At the assembly, the people that gave this huge report listened to all the testimony of the lesbian gay people, traveled the country. No one on that committee asked them one question. They were totally silenced. Never once did anybody use them as a resource. It was unbelievable to sit there. Sitting in the committee hearings, if we were, any of us, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, whatever we may have been, our family and our friends, it was ruthless, it was abusive, it was theologically, biblically, psychologically so erroneous in so many ways. The ignorance, let alone the hostility, was stunning. People were so thrown off by all this. It was like, and you can only imagine my youth group. They wept through the whole thing. Sandy Broaders then, as the seminarian who was from Princeton, she gave the report that said essentially, no gay person then, no person could be ordained as an elder, a deacon, or a pastor. She gave this report, and at the end of the report, she said, and by the way, I want you to know that I am a lesbian. The place was stunned. Not only that, when she came out, her life was threatened at the assembly, and they had to have guards by her room at night. She lost her scholarship to Princeton Theological Seminary. Nobody would sit with her. Because she lost her scholarship, people from the Gay Caucus and Witherspoon Society, who was also very progressive, paid her way then through seminary. I want you to know how serious it was, because any of us that have come out in those early years were always threatened. Our lives were always threatened. So the vote then was changed from the majority report, who had done all that work, had said, if a person is ready to be ordained, they should be ordained, no matter what their sexual orientation. So then that was overturned and called the minority report, and that again said that none of us could be ordained. This assembly, for me, I think was every night we would go to the suite, and every day we would pray for all the commissioners. And to watch our people do this was so beautiful. And at night, We had candles because we wanted them to come out of their session and at least look at us. Do you know what I mean? To just even see us as people. Many of them came out the door, and as we sang to them and lit candles with all our hearts, honestly, many of them couldn't look at us. They just walked away. When the assembly ended, Jimmy, my husband, turned to me and said, "Janie, this is hopeless. Let's get out of here." And I said, "Well, Jimmy, I just heard there's a worship service, and let's go to that, and then we'll leave." We walked across the street to a hotel, and we walked down these steps, and it was totally dark, and then there were these candles, and Roger Wilson was singing his heart out. And there was Chris, who had to pray us out of that assembly. There they were, Sandy and Chris and David and Roger and so many. And something happened to all of us in that worship service. It was like something inside of us. We just, in our singing and praying, we just caught a sight that we could do this, that we could somehow bring this church to see us. So Jimmy and I left. Rather than weeping, we left like, okay, you know. So he started Presbyterians for Human Rights. As soon as we got home, we gathered all these people together, and then we became a chapter of Presbyterians for Lesbian Gay Concerns. It was something, yeah.
Back to Lincoln Park Church. In 1979, 1 year after that horrid General Assembly, David, since here, floated the idea of being nominated to serve on the session. This would mean he would be ordained as an elder. Now, you would think that if David had been asked to be an assistant pastor in 1972, that this would be an easy step for the congregation to take. Well, not quite. Because the General Assembly had passed the definitive guidance, it was uncertain what the repercussions could be for a local church to act contrary to that ruling. Our nominating committee at the time did not feel comfortable choosing David as one of the nominees for the session. As the election approached in the fall of 1979, one of David's friends in the congregation, Linda Benson, let it be known that she was going to nominate him from the floor at the congregational meeting, feeling it was time to challenge the injustice of a certain class of people being unable to serve as elders. Now, interestingly, that same month, I was chosen by the nominating committee to stand for election to the session as part of a slate of 3 other people. And for those of you who don't know me, let me say that I was a gay man and was not at all ready to be public about my sexual orientation. Oh, dear God, what to do? I had been so excited at the possibility of being on the session. That congregational meeting came, and I sat in fear and silence while my fellow congregants debated for an hour and a half about whether a gay person should be elected to the session. And the end result was that David, who was open and honest about being gay, was not elected. And I, remaining silent, was elected. Very uncomfortable position to know that I was part of a system that rewarded my complicit silence and punished David's honesty. Everyone felt sad about David not being elected, and a task force was formed to figure out how we could change denominational policy so that people like David could serve in ordained office in the Presbyterian Church. Oh, how naive we were. And I always tease Janie at these things for going off script. I'm going to go off script. Well, you already know that in 2011, the Presbyterian Church did change its constitution to allow LGBTQ people to be ordained. But we're talking back in 1980. That was, we were going to wait, we were trying to change polity then.
Yeah.
We were actually going to have to wait 31 more years before we were going to be successful. But like Janie said, after that 78th General Assembly, there was a hope for justice that prevailed and propelled us forward to keep going. So this task force that was formed here in 1980 prepared a position paper which basically stated that it was the right and responsibility of the local congregation to elect elders and deacons on the basis of all their human qualities. This paper was adopted unanimously by the session and was received overwhelmingly by the congregation as the church's official position. So in 1981, on the basis of that support, the session requested the Chicago Presbytery to approve an overture to the General Assembly which would affirm the local church's right to elect its own officers, treating sexual orientation as only one of many factors to be considered. The sessions of 4 other churches in our presbytery joined us. It looked promising. Momentum was building. However, the presbytery defeated the overture by a vote of 111 to 79. I was devastated, and so were many others who had worked so hard on this. But having tried the legislative route, the session then voted to identify Lincoln Park as a More Light church in October 1981, saying that everybody that came to this church was eligible for full membership, full participation. In contrary to what our General Assembly had said. Nationally, we were the 17th church to make such a declaration, and David Sint was so thrilled that his home congregation had finally become a More Light church. As a congregation, we had made strides forward to becoming a more welcoming congregation and also helping individuals like me. I had grown to be comfortable with who I was and had been greatly encouraged by the amount of growing support from this congregation toward the LGBTQ community. I eventually decided I would not agree to a second term on the session without being open about all of who I was. I'm going to go off script one more time. I was reading this through last night, and what came to me was a scripture passage from John, and I looked it up. I didn't remember what it was, but it's John 10:10, where Jesus, and I'm paraphrasing here, Jesus says, "I have come that you may have life, have an abundant life." Or
have life and have it abundantly.
Have life and have it abundantly. And when this congregation helped me live more fully into my authentic personhood, that is a huge gift. That is a huge gift of abundant life. And if only the church throughout history could really do that for every person, give them the liberation they need from the things that they are dealing with in their lives. Anyway, back to the story. In fact, I did stand for a second term as an openly gay man in 1982, and the story is a long and complex one, which is beyond the scope of this presentation. So I will just mention a few key points. I first talked to David Sint and apologized for remaining silent at the 1979 congregational meeting when I could have spoken up. He was incredibly gracious to me, something I will never forget. And then I was elected to the second term with a 70% vote. See, there were still 30% of people were not sure. Do we want to put the congregation through a potential judicial case? And although I was elected, the presbytery would not allow me to be installed. I should have mentioned over the decades that many LGBTQ people were caught up in the church's judicial system because opponents of the More Light movement filed charters against them and or their churches. In our case, we did not do that. We went on the offensive, and the session filed charters against the presbytery because they had prevented my installation. And during this process, a representative of the presbytery met with our session and told us that if this Barry Smith story gets out into the national media, we are going to wreck the upcoming reunion of our Northern Presbyterian denomination with the Southern Presbyterian denomination, two bodies that had been separated since the Civil War, and were scheduled to be reunited in 1983 after a decade of planning. So we had that thrown at us, but we were not dissuaded. We were not scared off. And after a year of judicial proceedings, which were not fun, we were advised to hold another election because the newly merged denomination now had a different constitution. You see, we didn't wreck reunion. I was elected again, this time with 85% of the vote, and was finally able to be installed in 1984. This installation is believed to be the first installation of a publicly known, openly gay man in the Chicago Presbytery. And no one messed with us after that. And really, they had a couple months to file charges, and I kept waiting for that other shoe to drop, and it didn't. And ever since then, what happened for this church after that was that LGBTQ people have been elected to the session as routinely as anyone else. It was never an issue again. And I must say that I had tremendous support here in this congregation. Even from the people that voted against me were always tremendously supportive of me as a person. So now we have covered from 1972 to 1984, just 12 years. But you can see the impact that the More Light movement had on the ministry of this church and in the lives of individuals in this congregation in a relatively short period of time. But let me tell you, when you're living through it, it seems like decades.
1984 was a big year in my own faith journey. I had come from a very conservative Presbyterian church, and I was a junior at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, which was a conservative liberal arts Christian college. During my time at Westmont, and in this particular year, 1984, I chose to do a semester on the urban program in San Francisco. In that program, I worked 2 days a week as a chaplain at a Catholic hospital working with cancer patients, and I spent 3 days a week in classes with all of the other students where we dealt primarily with justice issues. I learned a tremendous amount that summer, not the least of which is that Catholics are Christians also. Up until that point, I had been taught that Catholics were not Christians and needed to be saved, and I could be one of the ones to save them. And then all of a sudden, I found myself in this clinical pastoral education program with all nuns, priests, and brothers, and my entire perspective was changed. They were amazing Christian people. That semester, I met and became quite close to Rosemarie Springer, who was one of the directors of the program. We all called her Rusty. She was not quite 5 feet tall and one of the kindest, most compassionate people you will ever know unless you drive in a car with her. And then all of that changes. Rusty was a Presbyterian, and she took me to her church in San Francisco, which was Old First Presbyterian Church. And at Rusty's church, I met one of her pastors who was an out lesbian woman. Her name was the Reverend Jean Richardson. I was completely blown away. I still had been thinking that women were not supposed to be pastors, let alone lesbian women. So she sort of blew me away in a variety of ways. In our classes that semester, we learned about the death squads in Central and South America that were sponsored by the US government. We learned about apartheid in South Africa. We learned about the gay and lesbian community, as it was called in those days, and about the new disease that was ravaging so many gay men. This particular semester in San Francisco, I like to think of using a California metaphor, which is that of an earthquake. When you live in California, you learn that there are different kinds of earthquakes. Some are soft and rolling, like that, and others are jarring and forceful and all of a sudden in an instant. And so this particular earthquake in my life, which was the dismantling of the faith tradition that I had been handed, was more like a soft and rolling earthquake, but one that definitely left a wide open space in it. In 1986, I headed off to Princeton Theological Seminary with the incredible support of a couple of my mentors, Ken and Jean Hansen, who were different in every way theologically from me and were some of the most loving people I had ever met to that point. I was enrolled in the Masters of Christian Education program because I still wasn't quite sure that women could be pastors.
That same year that Beth went to seminary in 1986 was when we lost David Sent to complication of HIV/AIDS. This congregation, along with other More Light movement folks, had formed a team to care for David on a regular basis. And David Sent's death led us to a greater involvement in AIDS issues and continued to motivate us to change church polity. Meanwhile, Janie was living in a major AIDS epicenter in San Francisco.
Right, so in 1979, I was working for the Oakland Council of Presbyterian Churches, in which we brought together African American, Chinese American, and European American folks together to look at the problems of the city. And I was named their executive director. It wasn't soon after that that they found out I was a lesbian. And that was the end. The same kind of tactic that for you, Barry, it was for us was, you will dissolve this council if you make this a problem. So I resigned from the council, and in no time, people were calling me all around the country to begin to do ministry for LGBT people. And that is, many of my friends like Chris and David and so on, they had really helped me think this way. So we began. And the first thing I did then was I went to speak at Metropolitan Community Church in San Francisco. And it's this wonderful LGBTQ church, and it was there that I fell in love with what it means to be Christian and to be lesbian, and it was so much fun. Oh my God, we had such a great time being queer together. And in fact, people were just seeing who we are, and we would bring in, people wanted to come and study us as though we were a specimen. It was so fun. You know, I'd call my friends and say, hey, want to be queer today with me? You know, it was so, so fun. So while there then, there was a thing that began to happen. There were young men that began to come to me and show me bruises on their legs and their bodies. And that was, of course, Kaposi sarcoma. So I would have to say, I think for 10 years, we held our breath. It so ravaged the community there in San Francisco, and it ravaged a lot of us inside. And what it did for us, I think, it really made us reflect. Gay men and lesbians were very much divided until HIV hit. And we essentially, this is the truth, we either changed people's diapers or we fed them, we bathed them. It was so incredible that going over those years, and even I said to Barry and to Beth, preparing for this, it has brought up so many things, not only about what the church had done, but also just the ravaging of what this disease did. And with this disease, I think we began to say about the church. There was a thing called the Lazarus Project in Southern California, in which Chris Glasser was running. So we said, let's start a ministry in Northern California. We've got HIV right in our faces. We've got youth that are committing suicide. We've got parents that want to come out. We began this thing by the seat of our pants called Ministry of Light, and we had youth groups and support groups and family groups and AIDS groups, and all of a sudden it like topsy-turvy. It was just unbelievable, a grassroots movement. And there were 5 Presbyterian churches that started this ministry, which later became Spectrum Center for LGBT Concerns, Marine AIDS Project, and so on. And in 2015, it became the Spahr Center. And with that, it was gathering all those people that had HIV and AIDS and were living now a long time, and then those of us that were queer. So we worked also with the national church, and that is Reverend Dave Martin, Southern Baptist. They called me on the phone, they said this, Janie, we got a Southern Baptist, a white boy, that is going to be coming to learn about people with HIV. But what Dave had done, he had been in Africa, and he had worked with people. It was called the Slim disease there. So Dave went to the national church, and he always said to me, you know, Janie, you should be the one going, but they never invite the people that are most affected by that. So he said, so I'm going to go, and I will represent us as best I can as an ally. And he was phenomenal across the church, telling people about HIV and AIDS. Also then, we started the Presbyterian AIDS Network. Catherine Cartledge, Reverend Catherine Cartledge, was the first person to become the chair of that, the executive director of that, under the auspices of Presbyterian for Health, Education, and Welfare. So we were busy. We were busy helping our people die well and live well as long as they could. We were busy wanting the church to understand who we were. We were busy challenging homophobia and heterosexism. We were busy doing all these years. And the thing that happened to us, I think that was most important, is we got our voices. So when we came to the Presbyterian Church, we no longer came confessing. We came feeling wonderful about ourselves. And why did we feel wonderful about ourselves? Because of churches like this. Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church. Can you ever know what it was like for us to come here? We came from east and west. Everybody wanted to come here. Why? Because you had David Sint and Barry Smith. Because you had stood against the denomination and domination systems. But you were not also a church. You were also a church that understood the connections of race, class, gender, sexual orientation. You were that to us. So when we came here to a packed church in which anybody who felt different was here. And all of us queers, we were having the time of our life coming together with you. So I just want to say to you how much we love you and who you are, who you have been to this. I know I'm off script. I know, but it's just been so much. So AIDS challenged us, humbled us, but it made us strong. And so every time then we came here, every time we came to the dental, wherever we came, it was like we had our voice. We knew who we were, and we became powerful. And before they feared us, and now they really feared us, you know, because we had ourselves. It was, well, okay.
While I was studying at Princeton, I was aware of the AIDS epidemic, but largely removed from it. In 1988, I was married to Jim Wheeler. That's not him in the photo. That's my study buddy, Alan Hilton, who actually preached at this church in this past year. I graduated in 1988 from Princeton with a degree in Christian education, and I became the Christian ed director at a church just outside of Princeton in Cranberry, New Jersey. The associate pastor at that church, the Reverend Gene Southard, was another person who created a kind of earthquake effect in my life. Jean was divorced from her ex-husband, who had come out as gay. She loved and celebrated him and was still good friends with him. She explained to me at the time that many gay and lesbian people end up in straight marriages because of all the things they're taught and told about what it means to be gay or lesbian. Jean also took me to the 25th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was the first time I had ever been to an event like that, and it was unforgettable. Jean was really the first pastor who showed me how to be a fierce advocate for justice in all ways. In 1991, I graduated from Princeton with a Master's of Divinity degree because after serving in Christian education for a couple of years, I knew I felt called to preaching and so went back to seminary. I was ordained as a straight woman and had no problem receiving a call to a large church in St. Louis, Missouri. In that same year, 1991, Janie had been called to serve the Downtown United Church in Rochester, New York.
You know, those of us that were queer, we wrote a letter to all the More Like churches, and we said, well, if you love us, at least interview us. You know, and choose the best candidate, and if we're the best candidate, choose us. You know, you could imagine the response, maybe 3 responses. But the Downtown Church in Rochester, New York, I sat in the living room of Virginia West Davidson, who was so for us, as you know. And so I thought, isn't this a great interview? And I had come with my partner, Connie, and they never asked me once about being lesbian. Not once, and that's all the church talked to me about. What was it like to be lesbian? You know, when I ask you what it's like to be heterosexual, you know. I mean, it's that kind of thing. And after a while, it was like, and they just kept saying to me, well, tell us about ministry, tell us about what you've done, tell us about the inner city work that you've done, and so on. And Connie and I, honest to God, on the way home, we stopped the car, and we just wept because nobody had ever just say, who are you? You know, beside being a lesbian. It was just great. We said, wasn't that great to have an interview? At least they interviewed us. But then the scary thing was they kept calling at me back. And I think I was interviewing them as much as they were interviewing me because the church had hurt our people so much. And I had this wonderful work that I was doing in San Francisco. So it was like, whoa, you know, I think they like me. And I remember so many things that happened there in which I had been so closed off from letting the church love me at all. And then I met people like Ginny and EJ and had tea with them and remembered what it was like to be with people in their homes and stuff. And I remember so many times just crying like, again, I was opening up again to a church that had said no so often to so many of us. So you know what happened then? They called me and it was like, what do I do now? And honest to God, I took a week. And they kept saying, are you going to call us back? You know, kind of thing. But I wanted to take a week because I wanted to hear from my friends who had died of HIV. I wanted to hear from them. I wanted to hear, was this something, was I supposed to come back? And I called my amazing associate, Wanda Graham Harris, African-American woman. We were called the checkerboard staff. She said to me this, say yes only if you are called to be curriculum to the church, because that's what you will be. And she said, as an African-American woman, in the early years, they used to touch my skin and touch my hair. Who are you? So she said, if you're called to be curriculum, then you be the curriculum. And that was life-giving to me. It was like, okay, I know my job. And so I said yes to them, and we started that All May Freely Serve, and we went all over the United States, 2 by 2, 4 by 4, because we listened to Jesus. You go out 2 by 2. You need to, right? And so we went out all across the country, and then we started these 8 regions, and one of them was that All May Freely Serve Chicago. And there's Gail and Jerry, and there was Linda Wygant and Jen Baker, and there were so many, and there's John Hobbs, who was the first co-chair with Judith Foster, and here's Bear. I mean, there were it was so the More Light movement, the shower of stoles, and thus we were known as the Three Sisters. And we went out across the country, and we just loved people into loving us. It was so incredible. And every place we went, every congregation we went, every university we went, every college we went to, every business we went to, we just kept inviting people to love us because we loved us. And it was really just inviting them to say, don't you want to know who we are? We're just so much fun. And it was this loving people back into it. And and they'd say terrible things to us. But you know what, we just kept, you can't take that on. You just have to keep doing it. And of course, Lincoln Park was so key, as I just said to you. You were so great to come to, because people would tell us that we were terrible and awful, and we were going to hell and all this kind of thing. And you'd say, thanks for your point of view. But you would, when we came here and we came to worship her, you would say things like this: you are a gift, you're sacred, you're wonderful. We love who you are. You sang to us. You loved us, so we stand on your shoulders. That's why every time I come here, I want you to know who you are to so many of us who needed your care, who needed your enfolding. Yeah.
And I have to say something about the picture that's up there.
Oh, yeah, I could
She
say
talked about going out 2x2. Janie and Virginia Davidson actually became known as the Thelma and Louise of the Presbyterian Church. Thelma and Louise without the cliff part.
Yeah.
And that's a picture of them in that convertible. They were a dynamic duo that was never seen before and will never be seen again.
Well, Jenny said, the last thing before I die, I'd like to go out with you and visit people in a convertible. I said, let's go. So, no kidding, Deanna Thiefenthal got this Lincoln Continental convertible, and we went out into the highways and byways. It was fabulous, but she was my ally. Even in her late 80s, we would go to all these schools, and they'd say, oh, who is this dear person? She opened her mouth and changed them, so I could have said horsepucky, and they'd have liked me. That's the truth.
When I first heard about Janie Spahr, it was in the context of some conservative Presbyterians claiming that Janie was trying to ruin the church. The same narrative that Barry was talking about earlier, that all the onus for the church was on the person trying to change the church. At the time, I couldn't understand why anybody would want to try to split the church. I also didn't know at that time to question that kind of narrative that wanted to keep a majority, a dominant part of the church in power. And then I had another earthquake happen in my own faith life. I was serving a church in South Carolina in 1994, which serving a church in the South was its own kind of earthquake for me, but because I am a little outspoken. But this particular instance happened at a presbytery meeting. At this meeting, there was conversation about gay and lesbian people being allowed to serve in churches. And I probably don't have to tell you that this kind of conversation happening in the early 90s in the South was pretty unusual in the church. But a young woman got up and spoke on the floor of Presbytery, and she was asked to speak because she wanted to be a candidate under care of this particular presbytery, and she was an out lesbian. So she was invited to tell her story. And at that point, I had received so many messages about how it was okay to be gay, but you couldn't be ordained in gay. Now remember, in the back of my head, I had the Reverend Gene Richardson, who I knew was gay and a pastor, but still had all of these messages about how it wasn't right. And so I listened to this young woman, and I listened to her with openness, And I realized the same thing happened to me as happened with women in ministry. I finally, to resolve my issue of women in ministry, went to a woman pastor and said, "What do you think about people saying women shouldn't be pastors?" And she said, "Let me just tell you my story, my call story." And she told it to me, and I walked away thinking, oh, okay, women are called to be pastors in the church. This young woman told her story of being lesbian and being Christian and being called to be a pastor. And I walked away from that meeting realizing, oh, gay and lesbian people are called to be pastors in the church. It was a huge moment. In 1995, after serving two churches that had been in conflict in different ways, I moved to the Napa Valley in California to be a co-pastor of a small and very active congregation. At the Presbyterian meeting where I was to be received, I met Janie Spahr for the first time. Now, after my experience in South Carolina, I did realize that what I had been told and taught about Janie Spahr trying to ruin the denomination was wrong. I realized Janie Spahr was also called. But I met Janie at this Presbyterian meeting, and Janie is the kind of person, as all of you know who have ever met her, you meet her once and you think differently about what incarnation means. What it means for someone to be God in the flesh, or as some people say, God with skin on. Janie is one of those people. Even Janie's worst enemies would talk about how fantastic she is. In those days, the language that was used for that was, oh, we love the sinner, but we hate the sin. Don't get me started on that. They would tell Janie how much they loved her, but oh, you just can't serve in the church, Janie. I spent the next few years sitting as close to Janie and the lesbians as I could at every Presbyterian meeting because they had something that I wanted that I couldn't yet articulate.
So my friend Sue Tracy called me. Well, I went to the Presbyterian meeting and I met this couple and I met Beth and her leadership. I saw her leadership skills, right? I mean, how can you miss them? And it was just, so I called my friend Sue Tracy and I said, Sue, there is somebody coming to the Presbyterian that is young and passionate and will do great work in the Presbyterian and so on. And she got quiet and then she said to me, well, Janie, I think she's one of us. But she doesn't know that she is. And that was the beginning. So throughout this time that I have known you for some 25 years, it was when she called me on the phone and told me that this is who she was. It was just an amazing time. I knew too, and Emily is here, and Emily and Wheeler, her children, I knew that in coming out and so on, but having to leave your family, having to redefine your family and so on, was very difficult. And I knew it would be harder for Beth too because of so much of that conservative thinking that had come in, like, how can you separate? How can you do this and so on? So I watched her. I watched her reclaim herself. And I watched her children be so proud of who she is. And then I watched her fall in love with Jeanette. And there's times in your life when people serve churches that you hope that their personal life and their professional life come together. And I see that. I see that in you, Beth. And this church is the place that you became, all of you. You chose a great partner, you have a great children, and you have this great congregation. So it's like, yeah.
Mm-hmm. In 1999, after some deep and intentional spiritual seeking and work, I came out. And Janie was the first person I told, which that sentence, Janie was the first person I told, has probably been said by easily 5,000 other people. So I'm not unique or special in that way. The reason I told Janie first, I think, is that I knew what her response would be. She congratulated me. She told me what good news this was and how supported I would be by the LGBTQ community in the Bay Area and across the nation. I don't remember how exactly it happened, but I immediately got involved in some of the queer advocacy work, primarily through Janie's organization, That All May Freely Serve. Janie and Lisa Largess, who was also serving with That All May Freely Serve, were my mentors, and over time have become some of my closest friends. Janie is the first one who taught me that you cannot be a one-issue person or organization. Unless you are seeking justice at all of the intersections, your work will be in vain. Janie made sure to center the voices on the margins of our movement, and so we were in relationship with people of color who were queer and allies, with transgender people who so often were left out of the movement completely, with people who were differently abled, with people of all different classes. Janie taught generations of activists to person the issue, which meant to be in relationship and to believe the way that being in relationship with people was the way that people changed. In 2002, I applied for a new position that was created with That All May Freely Serve. And I like to tell people that I was not called to that position because Lisa Largess had also applied. It has been the greatest honor of my life to have been rejected for that position, because if there's anybody I would ever want to be rejected for, it's Lisa Largess. I served on various Presbyterian committees, spoke up at meetings, attended general assemblies, attended trials, and I was public enough to be brought up on charges for being an out lesbian. The charges were dismissed, but it impacted my pastoral search at the time and meant I spent 3 years working in a middle school while looking for another call. This is a good place to name the cost to so many of the saints who went before and have come after me. Just to give you some perspective, Lisa Largess is my same age. She graduated from seminary 2 years before I did. Instead of celebrating her 32nd ordination anniversary this year, she's celebrating her 5th. She was under care for 30 years before the church would allow her to move forward. 30 years. She is my Shiro, and it's important to know that her perseverance and so many other people's perseverance came at an incredibly deep cost. One of my finest moments was on the floor of the San Francisco Presbytery after Lisa had finally been approved for ordination. The moderator was so flustered about how the vote had gone, thinking for sure she would be defeated and Lisa would never move on to ordination, that he tried to quickly close the meeting. I stood up, interrupted him, and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Moderator. Every other candidate who comes before this presbytery and is approved for ordination is given a prayer where we gather around and we lay hands on, and then we pray for this person moving forward in ordination." And then I said, Are you not doing the prayer because she's blind? And so we gathered around Lisa Largess at that Presbyterian meeting, laid hands on her, and prayed. And it was still years after that because of the case someone brought against the presbytery. I eventually became the interim head of staff at Montclair Presbyterian Church in Oakland, California, and loved my time with that congregation. I spent 3 years with them, and during that time, I began searching for my next call.
So, I believe Lincoln Park was coming to a close of calling a person to this church. And so I knew that Emily and Wheeler were grown, that Beth was in transition, and I knew all her administrative skills, her passion for justice, her spiritual direction, the great progressive preaching, all this stuff. And I remember thinking, I've just got to call her and say, you've got to look at Lincoln Park. They would be great because they are the match for you because they too love worship, they too love progressive. They would probably look at you, even because you're queer, they might even really look at you. But they would look, and it wouldn't matter what your sexual orientation is. They have those kinds of gifts of great compassion for people. These liberation work that they have done all these years. And it was like, you just got to apply. It would be great for you to apply. And I said their hospitality, the way they are with people, it's a lot like you. You would love who they are. So, there you be.
There you be. I resisted at the beginning when Janie told me about Lincoln Park. Took me a month or two, or maybe a little more. And I finally decided I would at least look. Janie said, just at least look. And so I did. And I was very interested in this group that I was reading about that seemed to put their faith into action and not just talk about the things they would like to do or wish they could do. So I applied, I interviewed, I loved the search committee, and here we are today. We both took risks in this call. You all took a risk on me because I had not been in any one church for more than 4 years at a time, and I was queer. I took a risk because you all were a small congregation, and I had served a small congregation that had ended up closing, and I did not want to do that again. But our risk-taking has been worth it, and then some. I've never felt more at home professionally and personally than I do here. I'm still not a city person, but I've learned to adapt. You all may still not love change, but you have learned to adapt. And when I separated and divorced shortly after I arrived, you supported me every step of the way in all ways. And when I later met and fell in love with Jeanette, you supported me every step on that journey as well. Jeanette has only ever been welcomed with open and loving arms here, and we both thank you for that. Even though I preached last week about how God is not in control of everything, and I stand by that, I don't know how anyone could hear these stories and not be awed by the weaving together of all of the different stories and the story of this congregation that brings us to this moment. While it is not my belief that God has been a puppeteer pulling all the strings behind the scenes, it is my belief that God has been quite present, quite active in all that has gone on, and I feel immense gratitude for the gift of knowing each person named and unnamed in these stories. We might wonder, was it chance? serendipity, synchronicity, providence, or something else that has brought us into each other's lives? As Jeanette and I like to say, nobody really knows. But there is no doubt in my mind that God has been with me every step of the way, speaking to me, teaching me, shaping me, teaching you, speaking to you, shaping you, and all of us, and all the saints, and through all the saints, all along the way. So here we are, and what a time for gratitude. Thank you.